I'm going to start off with a quote that I read from Albert Einstein. It goes something like this: "The world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch and do nothing or anything about it." When on the stage, you have the people that look out for the world, the regulators, the rating agencies, and people who look at global regulation. So to start off with this session, I think it's very appropriate for me to start off with Asrin. Asrin is someone I've known over the years with the Securities Commission. She has been involved in a lot of the regulatory work that we've also been part of. But recently, the Capital Markets Malaysia also did an ESG guidelines. And anyway, Asrin, over to you.
Thanks, Pramod. First of all, thank you so much to RAM for inviting me for this forum. Before I answer your question, Pramod, maybe I can just provide a quick introduction as well as context into what are the work and initiatives that the Securities Commission Malaysia has done with regards to the development of sustainable and responsible investment ecosystem in Malaysia. So this is an area of importance for us. It is one of the key growth strategies for the Malaysian capital market, and we have worked on this since more than a decade ago. One of the earliest initiatives that we did was the introduction of SRI Sukuk framework for the financing of green, social, and sustainability Sukuk in Malaysia. And then with regards to this, when we look at the trends in the past few years, initially, the first few years, we saw a lot of green sukuk were raised for financing of renewable energy projects. And for renewable energy projects, if you look at what's happening in Malaysia, is that this is an award that is provided by the government to the bidders, the solar farm producers, and a lot of them are actually mid-tier companies. So while the focus of the Securities Commission is in relation to capital market, we look at our intermediaries, we also look at the corporates, the PLCs, alongside the exchange. The other component that is very important is the SMEs. So while there is no direct mandate for the SC to look into the SMEs, but because they are a critical component of the Malaysian economy, they are part of the corporate's value chain, they are also the source of the corporate's Scope 3 emission, and they are also regularly tapping into the Malaysian capital market for financing. And they are also creating the pipeline of listing in Malaysia. So at this end, when we look at what's happening in other parts of the world, the importance of sustainability at the SME level is gaining more traction. There is an increased awareness. There is an increasing needs for that, not just from the regulatory perspectives, but also from trade regulations. I think Michael earlier mentioned about CBAM and the impact. So for the Malaysian SMEs, a lot of them are part of the global supply chain, and they will be impacted by CBAM. So this is where sustainability reporting is important also for the SMEs. I think just a couple of weeks ago, the Capital Markets Malaysia, which is an affiliate of the SC, just released the simplified ESG disclosure guide. This is a very practical guide for the SMEs, but it's being put together in a simplified manner so that they're able to follow the guide. It teaches the SMEs on how to track emission, what are the indicators that they need to place importance to, and how they can then start to measure and also disclose based on those indicators. So besides that, there's also a lot of capacity building that has been done by Capital Markets Malaysia as well. In terms of last year, there were a lot of workshops done not only in Kuala Lumpur, but also other parts of Malaysia, reaching out to SMEs around the country and giving them the practical tools. For SC, we also have our flagship program. We call it Navigate capital market green financing series. I think RAM has also been collaborating with us in this program in the past. So has some of the bankers that I see across the room also have participated in this program with us. So the program is essentially about conducting awareness and outreach to companies, not just in Kuala Lumpur, again, nationwide. We've been to Kuching, we've been to Penang, and also Johor on this program. And it's about creating awareness to businesses, not just the PLCs, but also SMEs and even the micro SMEs about what's the importance of sustainability, how they can tap into capital market to raise financing for their sustainability purposes. So this is an area or rather an initiative that we will continue in the coming year. And we also welcome the industry to work alongside with us in this outreach program.
Asrin, can you just also maybe touch on the fact that the SC also had incentives when you launched the SRI Sukuk guidelines? And because I find that was one of the areas where we had a lot of traction, but it's not in other jurisdictions necessarily.
Okay, so in respect of incentives, if I can just go back a little bit to a few years, when we released the SRI Sukuk framework in 2014, we were not able to get any tax incentive from the government then. Usually in terms of getting the incentives, how the SC does it is that whenever we introduce any new product framework, and the objective is to really to grow that particular product and segment in Malaysia, so we will approach the Ministry of Finance and discuss with them in terms of what would be the useful incentive for this particular segment. We also take into account the feedback from our industry in terms of what sorts of incentives that will be required. And also just to highlight that incentives are not meant to be there for a long time. We need it at the nascent stage to really spur the market, but over time all this will be assessed accordingly by the government. For SRI Sukuk, we had the incentive, it was first introduced in 2015, and I think just couple of weeks ago, the government also has announced that the incentive has been extended. For SRI linked Sukuk, the government also introduced an incentive which was introduced last year. And for the SC, we have also introduced the grant scheme. We have SRI Sukuk and bond grant scheme that we introduced in 2018. This grant is also tax exempted, and one of the among the qualifying standards for the grant includes SRI Sukuk, SRI Link, ASEAN Green Social Sustainability, and Sustainability Link Bond standards. This grant is also benchmarked against the grant that is available in Singapore and also in Hong Kong. But the two incentives that I mentioned earlier, I think that's only available in Malaysia so far. So with these types of incentives, I think the industry, particularly the issuers, have benefited because the incentives lead to lower cost of issuances that they can claim the tax deduction, they can get the grant and so on.
Thank you, Asrin. There's one thing in common that we had with S&P in terms of the ESG and credit rating. Bertrand, can you share some of that experience in how S&P incorporated the ESG in your credit rating process? But also recently, I noticed it was in August that you pulled out the indicators for ESG in your credit rating reports. Could you share, how and why that had to be, and give your viewpoint on that?
Yeah, sure. Many thanks. I mean, we've been incorporating ESG considerations for a long time in our credit ratings, to the extent that ESG quite often brings more risks than opportunities. So then you have probably a matter of labeling. What you were talking, ESG acronym ESG didn't exist 20 years ago. And we were trying to sum all our insights into an alphanumerical number concept, which we call the ESG credit indicator. We came to the conclusion that actually it was a bit artificial to force many ESG insights into one consolidated score, and that focusing more on the narrative was actually much more valuable for our stakeholders. And interestingly to me, what happened to us raises the key consideration of how do you communicate on ESG performance? What are the relevant indicators and how do you help, especially fund providers, make informed decisions? And to me, this is where regulation has a key role to play, because we all know the end goal, right? We are all hopeful that mankind will reach the Paris Agreement objectives, right, and limit global warming so that we don't roast all of us by 2050. So there is the objective, but to be in a position to build a roadmap, you need a detailed diagnostic. And to do that, you need data, and to have data, you need regulation to impose quality disclosures, which to me is a key topic, because I don't know if you've come across this new term of greenwashing, which describes behavior of companies under-reporting on their ESG credentials, just for fear of being held liable for whatever kind of information they are releasing. And so this is why, to me, regulation is a key enabler for Malaysia and other countries to reach their carbon objectives. But disclosures, consistent quality, systematic disclosures are a key requisite.
In terms of the global supply chain and the credit that S&P looks at globally, where do you see turbulence coming? And where do you see there's something positive?
So rather than turbulences, I would say changes. So obviously, increasingly highly exposed industry, as we name them, especially the high emitters, they are increasingly, exposed to regulations, and regulation is accelerating. So to that extent, what holds today may not hold tomorrow, depending, on evolving regulation accompanied with evolving technologies as well. So if you're taking the example of Malaysia, right, there is this green energy, I don't remember the acronym, sorry, the transition plan, right? And today you see that renewables, it's 5% of the energy mix. Energy, it's close to 30% of GDP. So that will shake, potentially. That will shake a little bit. So obviously high emitters are increasingly impacted by ESG-driven regulations, and this is something that we are capturing in our credit analysis. But more fundamentally, there is also any kind of listed companies, because Michael was discussing TCFD. TCFD is coming. It's already mandatory in Singapore, in Japan, in New Zealand, in other jurisdictions. So increasingly, you have some disclosure requirements, which are positive. We believe in transparency, but they are creating some compliance risks. And to your last point, any company exposed to, I would say, global trade will be impacted by regulation. And here I'm talking about physical goods and also financial, streams. And when it comes to physical goods, it's not necessarily regulation we are talking about. I think it's important also to understand that you have market-accepted norms and standards which support regulation and which add a level of complexity to companies. For instance, take Unilever. So Unilever is one of the largest palm oil buyers in the world. On their website, they say that they are sourcing, I think, 85% plus of certified palm oil. So it's not regulation we are talking about here, but the reality that it's going to be increasingly difficult for producers which are not certified to deal with those, MNCs. So I think that's for physical goods. When it comes to financial services, I mean, you have all seen this sustainable finance, disclosure regulation coming up in Europe, right? And you have especially 2 articles which are governing how funds can label themselves as being green, the famous Article 8 and 9. And the situation here that to be able to label yourself as sustainable, you need data. And data is scarce sometimes in this part of the world. So it may have direct implication on those Western fund providers' ability to deploy their capital in emerging economies. So to me, you have those two effects, finance and physical goods.
In terms of data, I mean, that's an important point. And from your perspective, Asrin, the expectation in terms of the data for transactions, say in the green bond or any future discussions within, say, JC3, Bank Negara will also be looking at data. We are part of that discussion where the ESG data set is being looked at. But I remember in all those discussions, we are collecting a lot of data, and whether the data is going to be used in that particular form or not, I'm not really sure sometimes, but it's the question of data in different jurisdictions in the form that you need it consistently. So if you're a bank in Malaysia and you need the same data to look at credit in Jakarta or in Thailand, how would you deal with it? And it's something quite interesting when the whole climate change movement, JC3, combined Bank Negara, SC, and Bursa working as one. And that was quite a good thing from the market participants' perspective because it was a unified force and we saw a lot of movement that way. But one thing I also realized is that the younger cousin of climate change, which is biodiversity, was not being heard. And I mean, are we going to solve climate change and then biodiversity is left out? And I only knew this because I went for a conference that WWF had, and there the biodiversity people were complaining that they're not heard. So I mean, data is something that's going to be important. So I think this question I want to cut across Asrin, Bertrand, and Mike finally. So Asrin, what would you say on data?
I think there's a lot of things that you mentioned, so I'm going to try to unpack that. I think, first of all, in terms of comparability of data, that is an issue because we are living across borders. Our businesses are across borders, investments are across borders. So to that end, comparability of data is very important. I know that earlier Michael talked about TCFD, but ISSB is also coming. So let's not forget that. I know it's only been a few months since S1 and S2 were introduced, but there are a lot of worries already, especially among businesses. Like one, they have to comply with one set of regulation, and then as just they are becoming more familiar with that set of regulation, another set of regulation is coming. So that all will actually add on to the cost of business. It may be burdensome to companies, the preparers of those information. And this is where for Malaysia, we are taking a phased approach with regards to implementation of ISSB. We need to see the market readiness. We have just set up the ACSR, which is the Advisory Committee on Sustainability Reporting that the SC is chairing. This is under the mandate of the Ministry of Finance. We have Bank Negara, we have Bursa, the exchange. We also have the accounting fraternities and the audit fraternities in this ACSR. So the ACSR will look into what are the gap measures that need to be addressed if Malaysia is to adopt ISSB, compare it with the current reporting requirements, and look at where the businesses are with regards to this, both the PLCs and also the SMEs. In terms of the phased approach that I mentioned earlier, this has worked well. When Bursa first introduced the sustainability reporting, we started with the large market cap first, and then slowly it trickles down to the mid and smaller cap. And for SMEs, I just mentioned the SDG is just out and still voluntary application. And in terms of, so that's in terms of the sustainability data, comparability, and so on. You also mentioned about biodiversity and nature. So just last week at the GC3 conference, so we had one session on TNFD, the Task Force on Nature Related Risk and Disclosure. So that session actually was an eye-opener to a lot of our industry players. Because all this while, we've been talking about climate, but people are just starting to realize that nature is important too, particularly for Malaysia, because Malaysia is a mega diverse biodiversity country. So there's a lot of impact to Malaysia if we're not taking care of our biodiversity. And another point also on data availability, we just announced last week the JC3 data catalog is now available on JC3 website. So the work has been going on for the past 2 years actually. So last year we first released a data catalog that was quite simple. It was just identifying what are the data available in Malaysia, where you can get them, and how to get them. But now we have built on that further. We have added on hundreds of indicators, data indicators, as well as how to get the data, and all the available data is already there on the website. So this is an important initiative, and we will continue to enhance it further and build on more data set.
Bertrand?
Sure. I mean, if we take a step back, to me, we should ask ourselves, why do we need data, right, in the first place? I would say that social data is important, but it's not necessarily as actionable as, data on the environmental performance of a company. And to me, the underlying topic, and this is where regulators have a key role to play, is to get data to be able to quantify externalities and to price them eventually. So I think this is really why we need data, and why it's much more important to get it in the E space rather than the S space, because, for instance, we all know that there are many ways to calculate an injury rate, right? But does it matter that much? I don't think it's as critical, but probably Michael wants to add something on that.
No, I think one of the things that's been lost, and it's been with governments around the world, is they've signed up to the Paris Agreement. That's really important. But what they haven't actually communicated to the real economy, basically all the businesses from the smallest to the biggest, a government does have a carbon footprint, but it's actually, when they signed to that agreement, it was on behalf of their entire economy. And so they didn't have a discussion and tell them, by the way, the reason we want you to collect that data, the reason we want you to measure that is because we signed up to a global treaty and we need the entire economy to do that. So I think, first of all, why that data is being collected hasn't always been communicated as well as it should be. The one thing, it sounds terribly daunting, collecting all of this data and then doing all the calculations. The one good thing, and I do remember one of your colleagues, Richard Matheson, who's at Standard & Poor's now, but before he was there, he had a little fintech company called TrueCost, which basically tried to tell you what actually the true cost of that glass in front of you was worth. And probably one of the first times they did an analysis on a company was on Puma, the guys who make the sneakers. And the CEO thought he was a really sustainable company, and they did a very, very forensic audit of them along with one of the big consulting companies. They found out they weren't as sustainable as they thought. But the reason I bring that up is back then, the cost of doing that was very high, the time was huge. But now with technology, both in Europe and right here in ASEAN, we have really, really good technology who can, on behalf of large corporations and SMEs alike, crunch that data, and when there are gaps, make assumptions using AI to kind of bridge those gaps. Because what you can't let is a gap in data paralyze you, and that's where I think it's really interesting. So the cost of doing the calculations has gone down because it's been automated, and bridging the gaps in the data, they're not always perfect, but it's a good step forward, and you can now have an SME get this work done meaningfully cheaper, well within their budget, and I think it makes the whole idea of the regulatory, and as you said, ISSB is coming down, which is great because it is going to be a global consolidation, which everyone will have to follow, so that means all of these different firms that are automating this will be able to use the same apples for apples and calculate together. But I do know it sounds quite daunting, but the data is essential, but there are ways to do it, and there's ways to do it cheaper and faster.
What I liked about the earlier session with the economists, the one economist that was very direct in terms of terms and how he didn't mince words in what he wanted to say. But I like panel sessions like this where I have to prepare and research. Every now and then I get a new term. I just like to throw this out as a quick hands-up survey. How many of you have heard of the term carbon tunnel vision? Carbon tunnel vision. Okay, if it has not become popular yet, we can make it popular. But it's something that I found in research. It's from this guy called Jan Konecko in Maastricht University. So the essence is, if we achieve net zero emissions and yet overlook human rights or fail to safeguard biodiversity, who is going to benefit or who's going to suffer? It's quite a nice chart. I mean, Google it, carbon tunnel vision, and you see this circular diagram. But it goes to say that, you know, we are spending a lot of time looking at data, looking at climate change. Then if we disregard biodiversity or people, in the end, what do we get? You know, we achieve those numbers, but a country is starving maybe because its people can't use the coal in its area, or they can't use the fuel because of it's too costly, or, you know, carbon taxes, something like that. So in that sense, when we look at ESG and we look at governance, that also plays an important part. I don't think governance is just for the regulators to look at. It's for all market participants. And maybe, Mike, can you share some of maybe your insight there?
No, your timing's perfect. I was just on a call. I'm on a group within the World Economic Forum that specializes in sustainable governance. So the whole discussion is, and actually we'll have a blog coming out fairly soon about how do you make boards aware of how to basically deal with this as one more piece of their work. And one of the things is you don't need necessarily to have someone who's a market absolute specialist, but what you do need is the whole board to have awareness across all the piece of their board, because then they all take a certain level of responsibility. Because if you don't have the G piece, the governance, you're never going to get the other two, because ultimately it's responsibility, whether it's a government itself because they act as a governance for a country, or whether it's the board who acts as a governance and the strategy providers for a company. So there's a huge amount of work out on this, and you'd be surprised, even on boards. I was speaking to a board of a bank last week, and I heard one of the board members whinge, "It's not fair." I'm going, well, no, life's not fair, and unfortunately, you're going to have to respond to this. And, but ultimately, that was not actually the response I was expecting from a board member. And so getting that education level up on the boards is essential, because we really won't get anywhere without it.
Yeah, but I would add that increasingly we've seen many boards in this part of the world setting up sustainability committees, whether at top executive level or even at board level. So I think there is this understanding that they need to educate themselves.
And ultimately, the CEO and the chairman have to take ownership as well.
I think just to add to that point, I think in terms of importance of incorporating sustainability at the board level, because it's about tone at the top. How then it's about those tone being cascading down across the entire organization, because there are actually at the certain organizations, they really need that leadership. So this is why I think the MCCG, the Malaysian Code on Corporate Governance, that was recently revised, also incorporated more enhanced emphasis on sustainability at the board level. And SC, together with BRUSA as well as the ICDM, we also have this LIP, we call it Leading for Impact program. It's an education and capacity building program tailored for those at the board level. So I think the response so far has been quite positive. We're seeing interest across the board, and this is a very good indication in terms of where we can see our corporates, the directors at the corporates level are going to play a bigger role in sustainability.
In terms of the future, I'm not talking about 10 years ahead, but even a year ahead, because every 3 months or so, there's some new guideline coming out, and those of us in this field, we have to keep reading and reading and reading. And the challenge, of course, is after a while when you read different regulations from different jurisdictions, you notice some points may be similar, but other points may be quite differing. So if I'm an SME or I'm a corporate in Malaysia or in Jakarta or in Bangkok, how do I circumnavigate this whole journey? Because do I get it certified or do I get it, if I'm in the US, you know, how do I deal with it? If I'm EU, you've got different jurisdictions to deal with. But how do you make this work? Because the compliance cost to deal with this will be high. So everyone wants to save the world, but it costs money. So how do they deal with this, and what experiences you have?
If I can jump in on this one, I think at the end of the day, each country is moving at its own pace. But if I was advising somebody in any country, I'll use football as a metaphor. If you're kicking the ball, you don't want to kick it to where your colleague is now. You want to kick it to where they're going to be because they're running. So consequently, if you're looking at global regulatory regimes, and you're looking at the EU right now is probably in the forefront of that, though I must say the US Securities and Exchange Commission just came out yesterday, and they will be taking into account Scope 3 for supply chains. So basically for ASEAN, both Europe and the US now will be important on this. So if your company does any business around the world, I would look at basically the jurisdictions that are most advanced, and I would probably just go right to that, because chances are you're not only going to meet your local regulatory regimes, but you'll also meet those for who you're exporting to. I would then also look for a company that helps provide the calculations and things of that sort, that is aware of the global, and if you choose to do that, who can give you both the local if you'd like to, but also the global. But my advice would be, why waste the money now to get here when you know within 6 to 9 months, or if you're exporting something, you need to be at that level?
Yeah, I would absolutely echo what Michael is saying. We've been seeing a kind of trial and error phase, right, of regulations, with regulators not necessarily coordinating very well among themselves and introducing some, some standards, some norms, etc., etc. But there is a clear direction, which is that of convergence and tightening. So to that extent, I would really agree with Michael, just aim high, because what is very demanding today may well become the norm tomorrow.
And there is a convergence. There's a group called the NGFS, which is basically, it's a global collection of regulators and central banks that do swap information. So not every country is in a vacuum. Most of the major countries are talking to each other, but I would still aim high.
So maybe I just wanted to add a little bit from the capital market perspectives. At the regulator level, we have IOSCO, which is an international organization of securities regulators. So this is where we exchange views, updates in terms of regulatory and developmental initiatives across our respective jurisdictions, where we look into what would be the regulator's approach in terms of new areas such as fintech, sustainability, and so on. So for SC Malaysia, we are a member of the IOSCO Sustainable Finance Task Force, and there's a lot of initiatives that have been ongoing at that level. And also closer to home at the ASEAN level, you mentioned about, the various regulations that come out. So at the ASEAN level, we're also looking into streamlining the regulations, particularly pertaining to sustainable finance. So at the ACMF, ASEAN Capital Markets Forum, which is a grouping of 10 regulators across the ASEAN countries, we released the ASEAN Green Bond Standards in 2017, followed by ASEAN Social Sustainability Bond Standards in 2018, and early this year we released the ASEAN Sustainability Linked Bond Standards. So these standards are aligned with ICMA principles, and how the standards work is that it becomes uniform standards on these particular products across ASEAN. So whenever a company issues a bond under the ASEAN Green Bond Standards, let's say it's issued in Malaysia, so the same bond is also being understood by the investors in other ASEAN, because it comes under the same label, which is the ASEAN Green Label. And for Malaysia, we have our own national framework. And from the statistics that we have, based on 2022 numbers, about 88% of SRI Sukuk issued in Malaysia were dually recognized under the ASEAN standards as well. So this shows that our market is able to seek for the alignment between national and also the regional standards. So this is a very positive development, and if we look at the ASEAN level, in terms of the issuances, we have about $40 billion as of September, and Malaysia makes up a third of these issuances. So we are the third largest across ASEAN in terms of the issuances under these standards.
And I'm sorry for jumping in, but if I can add one other positive thing about the issuance as well, a positive externality. So ultimately, if you're collecting data and you're very transparent about it, I started finance in the 80s in Wall Street when it was about asymmetrical information and trying to put as little out there as possible. But if you're issuing a bond, the more information, the more transparent you are, the better pricing you get and the more liquidity you get, which are really positive externalities. So not only are you meeting your regulatory obligations, but you're getting more liquidity and you're getting superior pricing because you've done that.
I think what I'm finding interesting is that the German government came out with a regulation recently. So if I'm BMW doing some manufacturing in Malaysia or Thailand, I have to meet that guideline where if anything goes wrong in the ESG, the parent company gets hit. And you've got the EU guidelines, you've got the carbon border adjustment, you've got so many guidelines going there. So for even a huge international company, the amount of legal risk or the regulatory risk that they're going to take on is going to be really difficult. So how do you circumvent this system and get everything right? Because I feel that sometimes this could actually stop people from doing business, because if they operate here, they have to follow Malaysian regulation, or if they're operating within ASEAN regulations. What have you come across so far, and in terms of where do you see it going? Because if each jurisdiction continues to build on guidelines, and then we have convergence on one end, but you need to have different regulations for different markets. So you have the domestic bond market in Malaysia, but you also have the international market where Malaysian companies take part in. So it's already an alphabet soup. How do we get the main fiber out of the soup and move ahead?
Let me attempt to answer that question. I think if you look at how we do things at the ASEAN level, is that while we work together in the development of sustainable finance for the region, we come up with various framework standards, even taxonomy, that would serve as an overarching standards frameworks for the ASEAN region. But it doesn't stop respective member countries from developing their own national standards. Because if you look at ASEAN, right, all the 10 members are at a very different stage of their economic development and capital market as well. Some are very advanced, like Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand as well, but there are some who are actually very far behind, like the CMLV. So while on principle, we agree on a standard, on a particular standard or framework that can be applied across ASEAN, but at the national level, there needs to be some form of contextualization in terms of their regulatory approach as well, whether it's going to be make mandatory or voluntary requirements, or whether those are going to be embedded in their regulatory requirements, for example. So for Malaysia, all the ASEAN standards, the 4 ASEAN standards that I mentioned just now, as well as a new standard on ASEAN sustainable and responsible funds that was just released early this year. So all these are incorporated into our regulation as well. So that means the capital marketplace in Malaysia, they have the option either to adopt or to apply the local standards or the ASEAN standards. But so that in respect of the bond market. In respect of the fund, in order to qualify under the ASEAN standards, the fund managers must apply the national standard first. So this is where differences in regulation would also happen across the markets. But having a set of the regional standards that help in fostering more cross-border issuances. And so I also mentioned about more than 80% of issuances in Malaysia are aligned with the ASEAN standards. So this kind of shows that one, there's a high degree of alignment between national and also the regional standards. Second, our issuers in Malaysia are also aware that by dually recognizing those bonds and sukuk, they are able to tap into the regional as well as international investors as well.
Yeah, sure. I think as we have just discussed, regulations, they've been converging, right? This is the reality. So when we're having discussions with all our rated clients with cross-border activities, they are telling us that typically they would focus on the most demanding standards, especially if they are headquartered, in countries where the rule of law is very well established, because it may look costly at first glance, but actually it reduces compliance cost because then the compliance is just very uniform across operations, and it also saves the trouble to have to adapt local operations, but because they are already abiding by standards which are above local requirements.
Mike, do you share that view?
I do, and I must say I've been peeking at the questions on there as well. And if you don't mind, I'm going to just grab one of them. They were asking about other than being forced to do it by regulations, which by the way you probably will be. But if you weren't, and I think the positive thing is, look at. This is the alpha opportunity of a lifetime for anyone who owns a business. So looking at how your business model works, by first figuring out where your negative externalities are, how you can start changing your business model, getting ahead of the curve, making sure you can beat your competitors. So I think from a pure business point of view, you will be forced to do it, but I would be getting out in front of that and looking at that alpha opportunity in my upper management. Because if your CEO and your board isn't thinking that way, they're missing something and they're going to be caught off guard on that one.
There's another question in terms of the S1 and S2, Asrin, that you mentioned. Could you chime in on that?
In terms of timeline to adopt, that's something that we have not decided yet, because we just set up the committee that will look into the implementation of the standards in Malaysia. So as part of the work, we have just established a consultative panel, which involves practitioners as well. So they will look at the, first in terms of how comparable is the sustainability reporting requirements in Malaysia currently with ISSB requirements? What are the additional things that we need to look at? And how prepared are our companies in terms of these additional requirements? Not to mention that, there's also the bit on assurance, because if you look at ISSB standards, assurance is also a very important element. So we need to work alongside the service providers that provide the assurance services, like the audit firms, for example. So whether are they able to do so? So these are currently ongoing. So until we've done all the work, we've done all the necessary stakeholder engagements, then only we'll be able to determine whether what's the exact timeline for this. But as I mentioned also earlier, for Malaysia, phased approach is the desired approach. So we will look at who would be most ready in terms of implementation? Is it the larger cap companies who would have more resources at their end and would be more vulnerable to these issues? Or would it be the mid-cap alongside the large cap to be implemented at the same time? So all that are still question mark at this point because we need to look into the feedback from the various stakeholders. But it's certainly something that we will look into and go on with the phased approach.
There's this question that says, how fast do you think sustainability will be regulated in Malaysia? It's tricky because you consider the SNG as well here, right?
So to a certain extent, it is already regulated. So for SC Malaysia, the approach is that we look into, or rather we introduce facilitative regulation. We need to ensure that our intermediaries have the appropriate guidance. We need to ensure that the issuers, the investors also are protected. So that's why in terms of the regulation is facilitative. It also takes into account on the need to allow the market to innovate. So if you look at the some of the product guidelines that we have, for example, the SRI Suku or the SRI Fund guidelines that we have, there are some guide rails that we provide. What are the requirements that you need to look at in terms of the disclosures, because this is a very important part, because investors need to have all this transparent information. But at the same time, there are opportunities and flexibilities to innovate, for the market to innovate as well. For example, in terms of the types of funds that can be introduced, impact fund, for example. So we've seen a lot of CIS structures, pure unit trusts or wholesale funds. But the guidelines also allow for impact funds to be introduced in Malaysia. And then if you look at the SRI Sukuk, yes, it's for financing of green social sustainability projects. So in the first few years, a lot of green projects, a lot of green Sukuk were issued in Malaysia. But of late, we're also seeing sustainability Sukuk is gaining more traction because our market is able to appreciate the interlinkages between the need to balance the environment and the social, and hence they are able to issue sustainability Sukuk. So all this is very important that the market continues to innovate and provide the solutions for the investors and issuers.
Mike, earlier you mentioned something about when you're doing something green or sustainable, more information, make it transparent, and so on. But you know, if I go back to Volkswagen, okay, you're sitting here in Malaysia and you're looking at this big company. You didn't expect Volkswagen to do that, and then they basically
committed fraud.
Yeah, so that risk is always going to be there. So how do we? I mean, companies can keep on spewing out a lot of information, disclosures. You can get 500 pages of disclosures to read, but someone can still do something.
I'm going to take that in two pieces because I love the just do it question down there, which I don't know if the audience can see this, but basically there's a question saying, should banks and financial institutions just, not even wait for all of the full regulation to come in and just start doing it? And part of doing it, because banks, insurance companies, and funds are in the risk-adjusted reward business. They all take risks. They all take risks every day. But climate is actually increasing the risks. So certain industries, like automobile companies who are not transitioning to EVs or hydrogen, or those that are in the brown economy, if you're a bank right now, you have to think, which of my clients do I think I can transition? That I can provide them with the CapEx funding, I can provide them with the loans to get them there. And which ones do I think I can't? Because those are mispriced the risk. There are literally coal plants that probably have LIBOR plus 200 financing on them when they should have LIBOR plus 1,200 or no financing at all. So if you're in a bank, those types of companies that you don't think you're going to need to do them, and this is the #1 topic amongst policymakers globally, how do you transition vital industries that are very brown? And I don't know if any of you have worked in a hedge fund, but it's a runoff situation, whether it's coal, whether it's steel, whether it's cement. Those are right now really mandatory for many economies. And each economy is different. The Swedes have already come up with 2 companies that can do genuinely green steel, but that may not be coming to, I don't know, Turkey tomorrow. So you need to figure out as a bank, how do you deal with that? And what a lot of the global policy makers are saying is, look, we need to understand when substitution is going to come in our country. So some of the emerging markets deserve a longer run on fossil fuels because the advanced economies had a big run, but they still need to know when and how to wind down and when the substitution's coming in and how do you finance that. That's one of the trickiest things bankers have to look at right now, and they have to have certain skills that they understand. You may have a coal plant and say, all right, this thing is going to run down at 3% a year for the next 15 years, and at the end, I'll take their steel, I'll take the PP&E, the property, I'll sell that, and hopefully that should make my loan whole. But that's tough work, and I would be thinking about that right here, right now, what your balance sheet looks like, because the opportunity that I gave you, those are the fun bits, but it's the vital industries that are highly brown, highly carbon intensive, and how those get handled on the balance sheets, because those will get picked up in the data, and in the end, you'll be left holding the bag if you haven't thought about it and structured that.
I think I would like to wrap up this with one perspective that each of you have from interaction with investors. A lot of investors come to us and ask us, what benchmarks you use. I think there's one question here that how does the SC assess whether data on greenhouse gases scopes are verified and if they are benchmarked globally? But I think that question goes across to all of us here, because how do we look at where the investors are coming from? They need to invest for, say, 5 years, 7 years, or so on, and they are trying to see whether if they invest in a particular thing, 2 years later or 3 years later, the rules change and they're stuck with something. So what's your interaction from investors, and what would you see happening over the next 3 years?
I think regulators can do 2 key elements. The first one is bring transparency to the market, and the second, give predictability to the market. So I think investors, obviously, S&P Global Ratings, we are talking with investors all the time. They want predictability. So this one is important. And transparency is as well. And this is where regulators can help a lot, I think, unlock the potential of markets, because we've been talking, about the stick. So far, there was this question around regulators forcing companies to do things. And I have children, so I believe in the stick. But the carrot can be also good. We've seen many regulators, including in Malaysia, providing some subsidies to help companies pay for professional services, to check what they are doing. Azrin was mentioning some assurance, but there is a cost to assurance. So it's great if you can get some financial incentives to foster transparency. So to me, those are the 2 key contributions of regulators in Malaysia and elsewhere. It's really transparency and predictability.
And I guess one other thing, some of it isn't just the regulators. It can't be lost that to the people here and our hosts are, some of the key players, because ultimately they're looking at your company and they're looking at your bank. And if you're not
Mike,
adjusting, your ratings go down.
30 seconds each.
Yeah, and I guess that was going to be my punchline, that it's not just the regulators. Ultimately, your cost of capital goes up if your rating agencies see that you're not responding, if you're a bank, if you're not managing your clients. So there's not just the authorities that are going to penalize you, it's across the board.
Okay.
So that's my takeaway.
Azrin, give you the last 30 seconds.
So I think the gentleman has said all that I need to say, but one important thing that we always look at in terms of regulation is that there must be a balance of self-regulation, market regulation, and also industry regulation. So all this must be there in order to have a thriving market.
Thank you, panelists. Can I have a warm round of applause for the eminent panelists?